The Amazon rainforest is sometimes called the lungs of the planet because it produces an estimated 20% of the oxygen in this planet's atmosphere.
Yeah, and that rainforest, which is so vital for our existence, is now being ravaged by fires, and those fires are spreading fast. About half of the more than 74,000 fires in Brazil so far this year, most of them in the Amazon, ignited in just this past month. Complicating matters further is that there's disagreement about what's causing the fires and even allegations that some are being set intentionally.
All right, Jake Spring is a reporter with Reuters. He's in the city of Brasilia today. Good morning, Jake.
Good morning.
So
Thanks for having me on.
we're happy to have you. You spent the past week in the Amazon watching the fires. Tell us what you saw.
So we were driving around in the southern of Amazonas state in the north of Rondônia state, and we were seeing fires every few kilometers that were very striking. Some of them were gigantic. They could only be captured by drone or by plane, sending pillars of smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Others we were seeing were just starting. There was smoke starting to curl around still green vegetation as kind of the dry underbrush after months of the dry season starts to catch fire.
Jake, wildfires happen every year in most regions with large forests, including in the Amazon. But this year is different, right?
Yes, that's right. So it is part of the natural ecosystem in the Amazon that there are fires. But this year, the statistics from the Brazilian Space Research Agency show that fires are up 83% year to date over the previous year. And also just anecdotally, I've been hearing from people it's never been like this before.
What's being done to get them under control? As you were driving through, do you see firefighters? Do you see planes dumping water?
I didn't see a lot of that, honestly. I saw one truck with a yellow truck with a fire prevention logo on it rush past. But beyond that, I mean, the fires are it's not one big fire, it's a bunch of little, or some little, some very big fires, but kind of spread out. So it's not like there's a united front where firefighters are rushing to.
Okay. President Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil has been criticized for not seeming especially worried about these fires. And he's even claimed, without evidence we should note, that non-governmental organizations are setting them as some sort of retaliation for his policies. What's he arguing here?
So he's making an argument that much of his right-wing government has been making since they took office in January, that basically arguing that NGOs are working on behalf of international forces to undermine Brazil's sovereignty. So this is just an extension, particularly extreme extension of that logic that they've been carrying out. And yes, it's important to note that he's made these claims without presenting evidence. That said, I've been in the field. I haven't been as tapped into what's been going on in Brasilia.
Okay, fair enough. But then you have the flip side, which is that Bolsonaro is being accused by some people of playing a part in the fires, not of setting them, but of helping them along. Who's making that argument? What are they saying exactly?
So it's environmentalists who are making that argument because based on Bolsonaro's kind of rhetoric in favor of developing the Amazon and indigenous reserves and these sorts of things, they're saying that farmers and loggers feel emboldened to set fire to the forest, to clear land, mostly for agriculture, and that the rhetoric is making them feel it's okay to do this.
Reuters journalist Jake Spring in Brazil. Jake, thanks so much.
Sure thing.
These fires in the Amazon really have gotten the attention of many world leaders.
Yeah, including French President Emmanuel Macron. He's calling this an international crisis, and he says this is what leaders should be talking about at the G7 summit. That's the meeting of the world's 7 largest economies. The summit begins tomorrow. It's being hosted by France, and global issues like the economy, trade, international security are topping the agenda as of now. President Trump is going to be there, and we should remember at the same event last year, this is where he refused to sign a multilateral agreement.
White House reporter Aisha Roscoe is on the line. Good morning, Aisha.
Good morning.
Okay, so what's on President Trump's agenda at the G7?
So the president's leaving Friday night to head to France, and at the summit there'll be some sessions on the global economic outlook and foreign policy, security issues. There's also going to be a panel on climate change and addressing another panel focused on addressing gender inequality. This is something that Ivanka Trump has championed a lot, trying to bring more women into the workforce around the world. For Trump, a lot of the attention is going to be on these bilateral meetings with other leaders. Right now, there are about 6 scheduled, and he's slated to hold his first face-to-face meeting with Boris Johnson since he became Prime Minister of the UK. They're supposed to talk about Britain's exit from the European Union and the possibility of a trade deal after that happens. Another scheduled bilat is with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. There's been a lot happening with Kashmir, and an administration official said that Trump will want to hear from Modi how he plans to reduce regional tensions.
So a lot of geopolitical conflict stuff happening. The original purpose of the G7 was to focus on economics and trade, and those are also areas where President Trump often makes waves. What are we expecting there?
Trump is going to be kind of beating the drum about trade and his concern about the U.S. being taken advantage of and his desire to increase access for U.S. companies to foreign markets. As you said, France is hosting this summit, but U.S. officials say that Trump plans to press French President Emmanuel Macron about France's digital services tax. The administration says it unfairly targets U.S. companies like Google and Amazon, and Trump has threatened to retaliate against France over this tax. You may remember he tweeted about possibly taxing French wine.
Yeah.
Trade is just one piece of this, because you have this backdrop of rising concerns about a potential global slowdown. Germany's economy shrank last quarter. U.S. industrial output is being weighed down by trade disputes. And so the White House insisted on having a forum, the first session, focus on the global economy. It says it's not worried about a recession. These markets are all connected.
Aisha, just quickly, last year, President Trump didn't sign the joint agreement that everyone usually signs. It seems like this year France is trying to avoid any embarrassment about this?
Yes, to avoid this, they're not going to have any big joint agreement to sign. They're just going to avoid it altogether.
Got it. NPR's Aisha Roscoe. Thanks, Aisha.
Thank you.
All right, now we have a sample of public opinion coming from Iran.
Yeah, an NPR News team has spent the past week in the country asking a question of almost everyone they meet. Who do you blame for Iran's trouble? The U.S. withdrew from a nuclear agreement and imposed new economic sanctions on Iran. Iran blames the U.S. for breaking an agreement. The U.S. blames Iran's government for its involvement with militant groups and wars. Though Iran's clerical rulers do not allow full democracy, it does really matter what Iran's people think.
And so Morning Edition host, our colleague Stephen Skeep, has been asking in and outside of Tehran. Hey, Steve.
Hi, guys.
So is there much debate in Iran around these questions of who's to blame?
You have to look for it, but yes, it's limited debate. Activists and journalists have been jailed here. There is a lot of tension. And when I interview people, they sometimes worry out loud they're going to get in trouble for what they say. And yet some people do speak out in conversation, find ways to get as much of the truth out as they can or as much of their views out as they can, especially ordinary Iranians who you find on the street corners or around town.
Okay, so what did you hear?
Well, some criticism of the government for the economic troubles, that's part of the discussion here. People do blame the United States. People are upset with the United States, and yet they're also upset with corruption in Iran. They're upset with mismanagement and inefficiency, and sometimes even within families there's this debate. I went yesterday to Karaj, which is a city on the edge of the Alborz Mountains, a little outside of Tehran. We met this extended family having a picnic outside, and they had different opinions. A couple of them were in the import-export business and have lost their jobs. Some of them are in real economic trouble, they said, and want to leave the country. And yet they still seemed like, by and large, a middle-class family, looked like a middle-class family. And some said they felt like they were patriots and they still supported the government, even as people in the same family said they were tired of rule by the mullahs and that they wanted more freedom, including, by the way, more freedom of expression.
Okay, that's really interesting. So the people in the family who said, no, we're patriots, we support the government, what was their argument?
Well, their argument was simply, this is Iran, this is our country, and things are not so bad here. And there are a lot of Iranians who are finding reason to support the government, even people who might be a little bit surprising. We've spoken with some what they're called reformist activists here, people who favor more democracy, and even some of them have been, while critical of the government, also critical of the United States, very critical of the sanctions. The other day we had tea with Marzieh Azarafza. She is a longtime reformist here in Tehran, and here is what she said about the sanctions.
I believe that there is a radical lobby of Arabs and Israel. They don't like Islamic Republic. They don't like independence and national government in Iran.
Now, as we know, Noel, the U.S. says sanctions are meant to encourage more freedom, among other things, in Iran, but she says the sanctions actually close off Iran and get in the way of efforts for democracy.
NPR's Steve Inskeep has been reporting all week from Tehran. Steve, thanks so much for bringing us these voices.
You're welcome.
It was a weekend of, I'd say, surprises, some confusion, a lot of mixed signals as world leaders were gathered at the G7 summit.
That's right. And this annual gathering is usually a highly orchestrated event. Leaders from the world's 7 most advanced economies get together, they hold bilateral meetings, then they usually sign a joint agreement. But this year there were lots of surprises. First, Iran's foreign minister dropped by unannounced. Then this morning, President Trump announced that China is ready to make a deal on trade. And then there are fires raging across the Amazon, so the G7, of course, is going to be talking about climate change. So this meeting is usually about unity, but this year it's really served to highlight divisions in the Western world.
And let's talk about what happened with NPR's Frank Langfitt, who's on the line from the seaside town of Biarritz, France, where the summit is being held. Hi there, Frank.
Hey, good morning, David.
All right, so speaking of things that were not announced, President Trump came out earlier than expected to speak this morning, and it sounds like tried to clarify his thoughts on China and trade right now, or not clarify? What happened?
I think clarify. I think that what happened was Vice Premier Liu He of China said that China is willing to address trade disputes with the U.S. through negotiations. And President Trump seized on this and said he had great respect for the fact that he interprets this means they're calling and wanting to make a deal, and had nice words to say about President Xi. I think there are a couple ways to look at this. First of all, this has been a trade war that's been raging for a very long time, seeming to really spiral in just the last few days, certainly. And we'll have to see where it goes from here, how far they can get with this. I think that if there's something to these words, certainly other leaders here will be happy to hear it, because they're very concerned about the impact of the trade war on their economies in Europe and elsewhere, as there's concern about recession in different parts of the world right now.
Yeah, concern in the markets as well, and we're going to be talking more about that.
Indeed.
But I want, Frank, this summit was taking place at a moment when much of the Amazon is burning. And I know President Macron of France, who's the host, wanted to put a lot of emphasis on that. What action, if any, came out of the summit when it comes to those fires in Brazil?
Well, we don't know yet. They're actually meeting on this very issue, and Macron says they're close to an agreement on providing technical and financial assistance to dealing with the fires. The United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson has already said they'll pay more than $10 million for reforestation. But the G7 is also divided over whether to use how much economic leverage they should use against some of these South American countries that they don't feel is doing enough. And so we're going to have to see later today if an agreement comes out and what they can agree on. But certainly it's a really big issue, and I think people around the world would like to see these big Western leaders, big economies come up with something.
Then, of course, you had Macron inviting Iran's foreign minister,
yes.
Which at a moment when President Trump has been trying to take a very harsh policy towards Iran. That must have been interesting.
Yeah. It was. I mean, it was literally the plane just arrived. You're just not far from the press center here, and people said, "Oh, the Iranians are here," who are obviously not members of the G7.
Right.
It was interesting this morning, though. Sometimes President Trump reacts very angrily at these events. He doesn't like multilateral events. Sometimes he will rage against people at NATO. He left here last year, left the G7 last year in a bit of a huff. This time around, he actually said this morning that he was fine with this. It didn't bother him. He just said, I knew they were coming. It's too soon to meet. So his reaction so far to the Iranians showing up as a bit of a surprise has been quite, moderate by his standards. And so hopefully we'll have a smooth rest of the day here as this summit wraps up.
NPR's Frank Langfitt reporting on the G7 summit in France. Frank, thanks so much.
Happy to do it, David.
And let's talk more about China now. I mean, there have been mixed signals and also a lot of questions about the U.S.-China relationship looming large over the summit.
Yeah, it's still not totally clear what President Trump is doing. Right before the summit, he announced new tariffs on Chinese imports in retaliation for China taxing U.S. products. But then during the summit over the weekend, Trump suggested he was having second thoughts about doing that. And then just this morning, President Trump said China is ready to make a deal. So as a result of all this uncertainty, the markets have taken a hit over the past couple of weeks. But this morning, after that announcement, market futures are up.
NPR's Scott Horsley has been following all of the markets' ups and downs and joins us. Hi there, Scott.
Good morning, David.
Okay, so wild few days. As we just heard, President Trump comes out and says that there might be some kind of deal being worked out with China. What are we looking for in the markets as the week begins here?
Investors like the sound of that China might be coming back to the bargaining table. Now, of course, China and the U.S. were already scheduled to have more negotiations next month, but this suggests maybe that'll happen sooner rather than later, and that did send the futures markets trending upward. Until that news from the president this morning, the futures markets had been signaling a further slide for stocks this morning. Remember, on Friday, the Dow lost more than 2.33%, the S&P 500 lost more than 2.5%, and it was after those big losses that the president came out and announced another ratcheting up of tariff rates. It's possible with this announcement of resumption of negotiations, those higher tariffs will be postponed. That's happened before, where the president has announced a new import tax and then backtracked before it takes effect. Trump did say over the weekend that he was having second thoughts about the trade war, although the White House then came out and said, well, his second thought was maybe the tariff should be even higher.
Right. Clarifying the second thoughts. Yes. So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the U.S. relationship with China when it comes to trade, but it sounds like that's not the only country that's been kind of in the focus at this summit.
Right. The U.S. announced an agreement in principle on a new trade deal with Japan. Now, in principle, there's a big qualifier. The details still have to be nailed down, but the U.S. and Japan hope to have an agreement finalized by late September, when both President Trump and the Japanese Prime Minister are due to be in New York City for the United Nations General Assembly. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer said over the weekend that a trade pact would be good for American farmers and ranchers.
Japan is by far our biggest beef market. We sell over $2 billion worth of beef to Japan, and this will allow us to do so with lower tariffs and to compete more effectively with people across the board, particularly the TPP countries and Europe.
The TPP countries there refers to the countries in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that big Asia-Pacific trade deal that the president pulled the U.S. out of on one of his first days in office. The other 11 countries in the TPP went ahead with that deal. So beef producers in Australia and New Zealand, for example, have been enjoying lower tariffs in Japan, while the U.S. has not. As a result, this deal would reclaim some of the ground that the U.S. lost when Trump pulled out of the TPP.
All right, NPR's Scott Horsley talking to us about how trade came up at the G7 summit in France. Scott, thanks.
Good to be with you, David.
All right, we're going to turn now to Oklahoma, where a judge is expected to hand down a big decision today that could help determine how much U.S. pharmaceutical companies have to take responsibility for our country's opioid crisis.
Right. So the deal is that Oklahoma filed a $17 billion lawsuit against Johnson & Johnson. And this afternoon, a judge is going to deliver a decision. Now, many state and local governments have sued the drug industry over its aggressive marketing of painkillers. So a lot of people are going to be watching this decision really carefully.
And one person watching it closely is Brian Mann with North Country Public Radio, who has been covering the opioid litigation for NPR. He joins us on the line. Hi, Brian.
Hi, David.
So Johnson & Johnson, I mean, is a company that many of us know so well. It's just a name brand American company selling everything from baby powder to Neutrogena skin products. How did this company wind up right in the middle of the opioid scandal?
Yeah, Oklahoma's Attorney General Mike Hunter gave his answer to that question, David, during opening statements in this trial. Here's what he had to say.
How did this happen? At the end of the day, Your Honor, I have a short, one-word answer: greed.
Greed, he says there. Hunter's team argued in court that Johnson & Johnson sold prescription painkillers while downplaying or hiding the risks, contributing to this deadly addiction epidemic. Hunter actually called the company a drug kingpin. So now Oklahoma wants Johnson & Johnson to pay to help clean up the mess.
Well, there were other companies involved, right? I mean, Purdue Pharma and Teva Pharmaceutical, they settled with Oklahoma before this trial even began. Johnson & Johnson decided they were going to dig in and fight. So what has been Johnson & Johnson's argument? What's been their defense?
Yeah, Johnson & Johnson basically said they're being picked on in Oklahoma because they have really deep pockets. They said they didn't actually sell that many opioid medications in the state compared with other drug companies. Another interesting thing, David, they pointed out that these medications are FDA approved, highly regulated and prescribed by doctors. The government knew all along, year after year, exactly how many of these pain pills were being sold.
So this is just one case, but it's really not just one case, because you've got hundreds of state and local governments filing similar lawsuits against all the big drug industry players. That there's another big opioid trial scheduled for October in Ohio. So, I mean, could this decision in Oklahoma today really impact what happens everywhere else?
Yeah, this is being watched for just that reason. So this wave of lawsuits, first, I would say, has caused the drug industry a lot of pain already in the form of deep harm to their reputations. A ton of information has come out about these companies and their sales practices pushing these drugs, some of it pretty unsavory. But, bad press and public outrage don't always equal solid legal arguments. And that's what we're going to learn today. Will these cases actually hold up in court? Will Judge Bachman, the guy there in Oklahoma, will he agree that Johnson & Johnson violated the law and make them pay on the scale that Oklahoma is claiming, more than $17 billion? If Oklahoma wins, the drug industry is going to get a clear signal that its liability in this national opioid epidemic could just be massive. I mean, remember, more than 218,000 Americans have died from prescription drug overdoses. But if Johnson & Johnson prevails, if the dollar amounts awarded are small, it could mean a lot of these lawsuits just fizzling out.
Well, you do set it up in a way that makes us all want to be watching very closely to see what happens in Oklahoma today. NPR's Brian Mann with North Country Public Radio. He covers opioid litigation for NPR. Brian, thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
And we do just want to note here, the former chairman of Johnson & Johnson founded the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is a sponsor of NPR.
In Oklahoma, a judge said yesterday that drug maker Johnson & Johnson is partly responsible for that state's opioid crisis.
Defendants caused an opioid crisis that is evidenced by increased rates of addiction, overdose deaths, and neonatal abstinence syndrome in Oklahoma.
So that was State Judge Thad Balkman there, issuing the first court ruling in a wave of opioid-related lawsuits against the drug industry. Balkman ruled that Johnson & Johnson should pay more than $570 million to help ease Oklahoma's opioid addiction crisis. Now, we should say the state had asked for a whole lot more from the company, as much as $17 billion.
Jackie Fortier is a health reporter for State Impact Oklahoma. She was in the courtroom yesterday when that decision came down. Good morning, Jackie.
Good morning.
So why did the judge rule against Johnson & Johnson? What did he say?
Well, the judge blamed Johnson & Johnson's misleading marketing and promotion of opioids and said that those actions compromised the health and safety of thousands of Oklahomans. And that's what this case was about. It was about public nuisance. As you heard earlier, he mentioned things like the number of opioid deaths in Oklahoma as evidence of Johnson & Johnson's impact. And to combat those sort of issues, the judge awarded the state more than $500 million.
Yeah, $572 million is certainly a lot of money, but it is way less than the $17 billion the state of Oklahoma wanted. How did the attorney general who is prosecuting the case react to that award?
Well, the judge said in his decision that the state had only proved a year of the cost of fighting the epidemic, which is why he awarded, like you said, a little over $570 million. And the state had been asking for 30 years worth of abatement. In his press conference after the verdict, Oklahoma Attorney General Mike Hunter was pretty optimistic. He even encouraged other states to sue opioid drug makers under the same claim.
Interesting. Okay, so you have other states suing, you have other cities suing, in fact. What does this judgment signal for those cases, many of which are set to happen this year or next year?
Right. I mean, it sends the signal to those municipalities that are suing that they really have a case. Those drug companies and distributors may be more willing to settle now that they've seen that they could potentially have to pay over $500 million like Johnson & Johnson is now. Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, settled with Oklahoma for $270 million before the trial. They were initially one of the defendants, which is a much smaller amount of money than Johnson & Johnson may now be on the hook for, not just in Oklahoma, but in all the other states.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Johnson & Johnson was always that it didn't settle, that it dug in and said we're not guilty. And after the verdict yesterday, the company said it will appeal. What else did they say about that decision?
Sabrina Strong, a trial lawyer for Johnson & Johnson, said during a press conference yesterday that the state and that the opioid company may take about it. I'm sorry. Sabrina Strong, who's a lawyer for Johnson & Johnson, said that the drugs had taken a long time to launch and monitor, and really by licensing doctors and pharmacists, they had their own oversight responsibility. So she kind of blamed the opioid crisis on illicit drugs, not really prescription drugs.
Jackie Fortier is a health reporter for State Impact Oklahoma. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks.
All right, French President Emmanuel Macron said something that surprised a lot of people when the G7 summit ended yesterday.
Yeah, Macron said he is working to broker a summit between President Trump and Iran's President Hassan Rouhani. This came as a surprise because tensions, of course, have flared between the U.S. and Iran following the U.S. withdrawal last year from the big nuclear deal. Since then, the Trump administration has imposed economic sanctions on Iran to try and get them back to the negotiating table. Despite those tensions, though, President Trump yesterday did signal the possibility of a meeting with Rouhani.
I think he's going to want to meet. I think Iran wants to get their situation straightened out. Now, is that based on fact or based on gut? That's based on gut. But they want to get their situation straightened out.
But this morning in Iran, Rouhani said he is not interested in any kind of photo op and would meet on one condition: U.S. sanctions must be lifted.
NPR's Michelle Kellerman has been following this story. She's on the line. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
So President Trump has been taking a really hard line on Iran. How did this talk of a summit, which would be historic, even get started?
Well, Macron, the French president, has been trying to salvage this nuclear deal and keep the Iranian nuclear program in check. He and a lot of other Europeans are really worried that the Trump administration's approach, this maximum pressure campaign and sanctions, is not only raising tensions in the region, but could drag everyone into a conflict. Now, Trump, in fact, has always said that he's open to talks and doesn't want war. So Macron is kind of testing that notion, talking directly to him, going around the administration hardliners who are advocating for regime change in Iran.
I see. Do I have right that a U.S. president and an Iranian president have not met in 40 years since 1979?
Yeah, that's right. And, even when the Obama administration was negotiating with Iran, President Hassan Rouhani didn't even shake Obama's hand at the United Nations. That was, again, when the two sides were actually negotiating that nuclear deal. Rouhani only agreed to a phone call with Obama, which was in itself historic, since there's really been no contact since the revolution, as you said.
Okay, this would be a really big deal. Do we have any sense of when it might happen and what might be on the table?
Well, when it could happen is at the UN General Assembly. But as I mentioned, Rouhani, didn't have meetings in the past, and he didn't agree to meet Trump in the past, even though Trump has tried that there. There would be plenty to talk about if they do. Iran's been ramping up its nuclear program, going beyond the limits set out in the nuclear deal. And so what Macron wants to do is get the two sides back to the negotiating table, ease up on sanctions to get Iran back into compliance, and then work through all the other problems that the U.S. has with the agreement. Trump seemed open to that, though his administration says it will keep up the sanctions. He said he and Macron are talking about things like short-term credits to get Iran through a difficult economic period, credits backed up by oil. And then Trump also said that, he has confidence that the Iranians want to get something done and want to come talk to him about because it's the economy is suffering.
Michelle, is there anyone who would not like this summit to happen?
Yeah, well, the Saudis would be worried about any diplomatic overture with their main rival in the region. Israel has been bombing Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. They would be concerned, and Trump would likely get pushback from his own advisors, who have been Iranian hardliners for a long time.
Yeah. NPR's Michelle Kellerman. Thanks so much, Michelle.
Sure thing.
All right, in Newark, New Jersey, this was the sound last night.
Asking for clean water. Those demonstrators were gathered in Newark yesterday to protest elevated lead levels in the city's drinking water. This problem, we should say, has been going on there for years, and recently many Newark residents have been relying on bottled water as city leaders are struggling to address this crisis. Yesterday's protests happened against the backdrop of MTV's Video Music Awards, which were held at Newark's Prudential Center, and that did raise questions about what exactly the city is prioritizing.
Gwen Hogan of New York Public Radio was there. She's on the line now. Hi, Gwen.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. So an interesting time and place for protesters to gather. Why did they go to the VMA Awards?
Yeah, I think for two reasons. Activists that I spoke to who had organized this event said, on the one hand, there are people from all over the country who are here to see it, as well as national and international celebrities that are in their city. And on the other hand, there were city officials attending this event. And, as one woman I put it said, I don't understand how you can party while our children are being poisoned with lead.
Wow. All right. So what else did you see last night?
So it started out a little bit tense. The protesters had started at a train station nearby and tried to push past some lines of security to get closer to the Prudential Center. And there was a line of police officers. There was a line of police officers on horses that tried to careen the crowd away. And it was intense at the beginning, but then the protesters kind of retreated and went into a plaza where there were lines of people waiting to get into the Prudential Center. And they basically stood there and made their pitch to these people, many of whom had never heard about what was happening in Newark.
Wow. As David mentioned, this water crisis isn't new. It's been going on for a while. What happened to bring it to the forefront, to draw attention?
Yeah, it has. The city has had elevated levels of lead in some of its water for several years now. But earlier this month, the federal government told Newark it had to begin giving bottled water to residents. And that happened because the city had tested some of these water filters it had given out. These filters were supposed to reduce lead in the water, and many residents were using them for drinking and cooking. But backup tests of just a few of them found they weren't working. So that's what sort of set this whole thing in motion, the city beginning to try to distribute bottled water out of several distribution sites. And now they're trying to figure out basically what happened with these filters, and we'll know more about that in the coming weeks.
Aside from distributing bottled water, what else is the city doing to address this?
Right. Well, there was a big announcement made yesterday, earlier in the day. The city essentially has secured a bond. Well, not yet. It's in the process of securing a bond from Essex County, where it's located, that would allow it to fast track a lot of these repairs, $120 million. And that would go to replacing all of the lead service lines. And those are the pipes that attach private homes to the city's water mains, and do that in under 3 years. So this is a big deal, but a lot of the activists said, hey, I have been so misled by this administration at this point that it's hard for me to trust that you're going to get that done.
Okay, and just quickly, are Newark residents in the meantime just relying on bottled water?
That's right. That's what they're going to have to do until they figure out what happened with the filters.
Reporter Gwen Hogan from New York Public Radio. Gwen, thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Could it happen again? 2 years after Hurricane Maria, a major storm is headed towards Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and even as the storm is approaching, the Trump administration is talking about transferring millions of dollars in disaster relief funds away from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The administration wants to take that money away from FEMA disaster relief, money that would go towards helping communities clean up and rebuild after storms and instead use it for border enforcement operations.
NPR's White House correspondent Franco Ordonez has been following the story and is in studio with us this morning. Hi, Franco.
Hi.
So tell us more about exactly where this money is coming from and where it would go.
Well, the administration plans to move $271 million, more than half of which will be from FEMA for detention beds for migrants and facilities for court cases. As you can imagine, it's being taken pretty personally by some. Remember how Trump publicly feuded with some leaders of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria 2 years ago? Mm-hmm. And, I don't think the timing could be much worse. This is peak hurricane season. The majority of all storms occur around this period from mid-August through September.
Right. And so we've obviously heard for many, many months on end about the numbers of migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. Explain more about what the Trump administration is saying about why it needs to divert these funds.
Yeah, the administration claims that this surge at the border has overwhelmed resources, that they have no choice to do it. They say they need this money to address a lack of detention space, particularly for an increase in single adults coming to the border. As you can imagine, Democrats are slamming the decision. They say the administration is overstepping its authority to push their own policies. Senator Chuck Schumer called the plan, quote, backwards and cruel. But supporters, they're arguing that Congress has left them no choice. They say the money has to be found somewhere because Congress hasn't given them what it needs.
Is that true? Has Congress taken up legislation that would provide these funds? Because no doubt their resources are stretched. We've been hearing about how there aren't enough judges. There aren't enough hearing rooms for these immigration courts.
Yeah, if you talk to advocates, for sure that Congress has been providing. It was just a few weeks ago, last month, where you remember there was that big hubbub between Congress and the president about humanitarian funds that went back and forth. And they did give millions of dollars for humanitarian needs. The administration says that was for humanitarian needs, not for detention. Advocates did not want money to be used for, quote unquote, enforcement activities.
Because they're afraid that if they give more money for detention, that will facilitate more detention.
Exactly.
Which they don't necessarily want to see. So you mentioned we are in the midst of hurricane season. Puerto Rico is getting ready for what could be a really major storm. Could this reallocation of these funds from FEMA, could that directly impact the people in Puerto Rico?
Well, the Department of Homeland Security says it will not. And late yesterday, President Trump approved an emergency declaration for Puerto Rico and ordered that federal assistance to help with the local response. I should note it's not uncommon for funds to be transferred between agencies at the end of the year. Uh-huh. DHS says that the funds are from leftover money from prior years, and that, quote, absent significant new catastrophic events, the department believes the funds will have enough money to operate. But, Trump really didn't help matters when he bemoaned via Twitter how much Congress had previously allocated for recovery efforts for Hurricane Maria using very inflated figures.
All right, NPR White House correspondent Franco Ordonez. Franco, thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to get more now on details of that very storm that's approaching several Caribbean islands, including Puerto Rico.
Yes, So this is Tropical Storm Dorian. It's expected to pass over Puerto Rico later today. The National Hurricane Center is warning the storm could bring a whole lot of rain, very strong winds, and what they're saying is life-threatening flash flooding to the island. National Hurricane Center meteorologist Dennis Feltgen is saying even if the storm doesn't reach hurricane strength, it could pose a real threat to Puerto Rico.
They are looking at a very significant amount of rain, and that'll be especially true on the western and southwestern part of the island, where we could be seeing as much as 4 to 6 inches of rain with isolated 8 inches of rain. And it's been wet, so it won't take much to pull trees down with any kind of tropical storm force winds.
Okay, now even though this storm is not forecast as of now to be as strong as Hurricane Maria, which of course devastated Puerto Rico in 2017, people on the island are still recovering from that storm, and they are taking precautions here.
NPR's Adrian Florido is in Puerto Rico and joins us now on the line. Adrian, can I ask you to just put on your meteorologist hat and give us the list on the path of the storm and its severity?
Well, the storm is expected to make landfall somewhere on Puerto Rico's eastern coast later today. I think we got a pretty good description in the introduction of the types of impacts it could have. So, heavy rainfall, heavy winds. This storm is actually nowhere near as big as Hurricane Maria was 2 years ago, but it is the first major storm to threaten Puerto Rico since Maria. And Puerto Rico is still very fragile. After Maria, there are tens of thousands of homes that still have those infamous blue tarps over their roofs. And Mother Nature hasn't really put the power grid or the communication systems to the test since Maria. And so this storm could be the first time that we really get a sense of how the infrastructure in Puerto Rico is going to hold up.
I mean, we have had you on recently to talk about all the chaos that's been happening in the government in Puerto Rico. I mean, there's so many musical chairs about who's actually in charge. And I guess there's some stability now. But is the government ready for this?
The government says it's ready. 2 days ago and again last night, the new governor, Wanda Vázquez, held press conferences. And in the first press conference, she spent, like half an hour reading off this long list of all the things that she said the government has done to prepare. So things like stock up on utility poles, sign agreements with U.S. companies so that they can arrive quickly and start restoring power should that be needed. She said that they've installed radio communication systems across Puerto Rico. They've acquired more than 1,000 generators. They've made sure the hospitals are ready. So it's this long, long list that she's hoping will reassure people. But, the memories of Hurricane Maria and the government's bungled response to it are still very fresh in people's minds. And so people are skeptical about whether the government really is prepared.
Right. So Franco mentioned earlier that the President Trump, tweeted about the pending storm, seeming to bemoan the fact that another storm could be hitting Puerto Rico and the demand for federal funds to meet that disaster response. What do you know about the coordination so far between the federal government and Puerto Rico's government in order to prepare for this?
I think it's hard to independently assess how good that coordination has been. I mean, the governor says that it has been good. She has praised the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and President Trump, who yesterday signed an emergency declaration. FEMA says it spread hundreds of staff onto the island in anticipation of the storm.
Yeah.
The real test, of course, will be how the government responds should a major response be needed.
Okay, NPR's Adrian Florido in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Rachel.
Okay, now we shift our focus to North Carolina, where the state's Attorney General Josh Stein is taking on e-cigarette companies and what he sees as a public health crisis.
We conquered the nicotine addiction years ago, and in the last 3 years, the e-cigarette manufacturers have completely evaporated all the gains we made in terms of reducing teen smoking.
So Stein has filed lawsuits against 8 e-cigarette manufacturers, alleging the companies are illegally targeting children. And this move follows a lawsuit Stein filed in May against San Francisco-based Juul, one of the nation's larger e-cigarette companies.
Jason DeBruin of member station WUNC has been following this, and he joins us on the line. Hi, Jason.
Hi, good morning.
So, as we noted, the North Carolina Attorney General has already sued Juul. Now he's adding 8 other companies. Is the gist the same? Are these suits similar?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, they're pretty similar. Obviously not exactly the same, but largely they're pretty much similar. And our Attorney General has been taking a close look at the e-cigarette industry here lately, and that's especially as smoking, particularly e-cigarette smoking, is up among younger smokers. And our Attorney General is saying that that's driven specifically, as you heard at the top, specifically by these e-cigarettes, by vaping. So regarding those 8 manufacturers that he filed suit against, Stein alleges that they are specifically and aggressively targeting kids under the age of 18, which obviously is the legal smoking age. And in addition to that these companies are not taking the precautionary steps to verify that these kids are actually 18 when they're buying the devices.
And that's not happening. We're not talking about someone going into a gas station and buying e-cigarettes. This is online. When kids try to buy them online, there's no requirement to verify their age. But I want to ask about the marketing of this. What's the evidence? What does he point to as evidence that these companies are directly targeting kids?
So his complaint lists several examples. There's a lot of advertising online, as you mentioned, on social media, Instagram, other social media places where youth spend a lot of time. And the ads really do seem like they're tailored towards young people. There's one ad, for instance, where the e-cigarette device looks like a thumb drive that you might plug into your computer, and the ad reads, "Oh, mom, it's just a USB," right? And that kind of language really does make you think that it's targeting children. And then in addition to that, there's obviously the issue of flavors. So traditional tobacco products, you might know, are limited to just the two flavors. There's the traditional tobacco flavor and menthol,
right?
But those restrictions do not apply to e-cigarettes, and some of these flavors really have gotten quite exotic, right? I mean, there's bubblegum, French toast, creme brulee. I mean, the list goes on and on. I'm sure you might have even seen some of the really exotic flavors that are out there.
Right. I don't know how a creme brulee
Right,
e-cigarette
exactly.
tastes, but yeah, clearly they're
Right,
trying to
and
attract a certain demo.
Right. And you could even look at the devices themselves. So there's one example where the device looks like a juice box, and it even has like a plastic straw on the side to give a realistic effect. So you can sort of understand why he says that these are targeted towards young people.
And it's also significant. We should note that this is happening in North Carolina, right? Where the economy, clearly, tobacco has been a big part of that state's economy for a long time. Jason DeBruin from member station WUNC. Jason, thanks. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
It looks like Puerto Rico has been spared the worst of Hurricane Dorian. This morning, people there are breathing a sigh of relief.
Yeah, with memories of Hurricane Maria from 2017 still top of mind, people in Puerto Rico were obviously anxious as this storm approached. Yesterday, though, Dorian barreled past the island, moved over the U.S. Virgin Islands, and is now headed north. The storm is gaining strength, and forecasters warn it could strike Florida in coming days.
NPR's Adrian Florido is in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where he has been monitoring developments in the storm's path. Hey, Adrian.
Hi, David.
What's it like there? It sounds like Puerto Rico was mostly spared.
Yeah, thankfully there were no reports of major damage here. There were widespread power outages in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and reports of more limited outages here in parts of Puerto Rico. The main island of Puerto Rico was even spared any heavy rain or winds, thankfully. There are two small island municipalities off of Puerto Rico's eastern coast, Vieques and Culebra, that did get more rain and wind, a little bit more of a direct impact, but also mostly came away unscathed.
And the Virgin Islands, I mean, it sounds like they had it pretty rough, but how bad was it there?
Yeah, I mean, there are also not yet any reports of major damage there, except for those widespread power outages. I understand that work is underway to get power restored there, but it seems like, thankfully, the Virgin Islands were also not terribly affected.
Talk about the feeling in Puerto Rico and the anxiety there leading up to this, just because of the memories of Hurricane Maria. I mean, was there a sense that the island was better prepared for this one if it got bad?
No, people were definitely worried. On Wednesday, everything was shut down and people hunkered down. The streets were empty. I think people were doing their best to tame the emotions that talk of any major storm brings back about the horrible experience of Hurricane Maria and all of the suffering that people endured during and after that storm. In terms of preparation, the government said that it was better prepared. It seems to have taken a lot of steps to improve on what was that terrible response to Hurricane Maria 2 years ago. And Dorian was seen as a test for the new governor, Wanda Vazquez. And she said that she believes that local and federal agencies came together, and if things had gotten worse, they would have been able to handle it. But because the effects of Dorian were limited, it's hard to say for sure whether the government would, in fact, have responded effectively.
It's so interesting. I mean, I've been through hurricane moments like in Florida where you really brace and you batten down the hatches and you get ready, and then the storm is not so bad. It can actually take some time to get back to life again, even if the storm wasn't terrible. Is that what it feels like on the island today?
Yeah, I mean, life is expected to resume as normal today. Originally, schools and government offices were supposed to be closed today because it was expected that the impacts of the storm were going to be much greater than they actually were. But last night, the governor reversed that decision to close schools and government offices. So people will be going back to class, coming back to work. Stores will be opening up again, and the rhythm of life is expected to resume as normal here.
And I guess we're just following the path of the storm in the coming days, and it looks like Florida could be a real target potentially.
Right, so Dorian is heading north through the Atlantic and is on a path toward Florida's eastern coast. It is expected to come ashore sometime late Sunday or early Monday, and it's also gaining strength. It's currently a Category 1 hurricane, but it's expected to grow as large as a Category 3 storm by Sunday. So Governor Ron DeSantis has declared a state of emergency, and it seems that Florida is doing its best to start getting ready for the impact of that storm over the weekend.
Okay, and obviously we'll be monitoring the path of the hurricane in the coming days. NPR's Adrian Florido in San Juan, Puerto Rico this morning. Thanks so much, Adrian.
Thanks, David.
All right, so the pool of Democratic presidential candidates is shrinking.
Indeed. So the deadline for candidates to meet the DNC's polling and fundraising thresholds for the debate was midnight. And many of the more familiar names, we're talking about former Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, they all made the cut, but several candidates did not. The next debate is going to take place in a couple of weeks in Houston, Texas. Meanwhile, we should mention, not insignificant, New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who had never been able to get a lot of traction in the polls, has pulled herself out of the race altogether.
Okay, we have NPR senior political editor Domenico Montanaro with us. Hi, Domenico.
Hey there, David.
All right, so this is what happens when a campaign moves along. You have fewer and fewer candidates. There's going to be a smaller group in Texas next month. Rachel mentioned Biden, Sanders, Warren made the cut. Who else is going to be there?
Yeah, I'll just go through them quickly.
Yeah.
Senators Cory Booker of New Jersey, Kamala Harris from California, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, as well as Mayor Pete Buttigieg, former Obama Housing Secretary Julian Castro, former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who recently rebooted his campaign in El Paso, Texas, where he's from, and entrepreneur Andrew Yang. So there you go, just half the candidates from the first round of debates.
Is this important? I mean, can these candidates who made the list say this is a significant moment? I'm still here as it reaches this stage.
Absolutely, and we've seen several candidates drop out. So these debates have really had sort of a winnowing effect of being almost the first primary, replacing some of those early states because people have started to drop out. And it's significant that they got here because there's tougher qualifications for this than these earlier debates. They needed 2% in at least 4 national or state polls, 130,000 donors across 20 states. They needed at least 400 unique donors in each of those states. So this really does represent a group that's been able to, over these several months of campaigning, be able to distinguish themselves, raise their profiles, and show some significant grassroots support.
And then we have candidates who didn't make the cut who are raising some questions about how this whole thing was handled.
Right. You had, for example, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, who was on Fox News complaining about the process. Let's listen to some of that.
The whole thing gets a little bit confusing, and you've got to jump way down into the weeds of the numbers and the statistics. But I think the bigger problem is that the whole process really lacks transparency.
Right.
People deserve having that transparency because ultimately it's the people who will decide who our Democratic nominee will be and ultimately who our next president, commander-in-chief will be.
That was a pretty familiar kind of complaint that you heard from her, as you heard from other candidates, and what you've heard in past years, frankly, for people who don't make debate stages. But, to be honest, the Democratic National Committee's guidelines for making these debates have been pretty well known for some time. Gabbard just didn't meet them. So, that's really what's happened with her campaign, and she'll have a chance to make it for the next month.
All right, so in Houston, we'll have this group of 10 candidates, and this will be the first time Warren, Biden, and Sanders will all be on stage together, yeah?
Yeah, it's really notable that the three of them are on stage together for the first time. They represent very different wings of the party from a policy and a tactical perspective. I mean, some would call it a reset versus revolution, with Biden being the reset and Sanders and Warren being revolution. We'll see if they all wind up going after Biden again.
NPR senior political editor Domenico Montanaro. Thanks, Domenico.
You're welcome.
All right, we're going to talk now about Britain, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson, with the Queen's blessing, will suspend Parliament next month.
Yeah, the move is going to limit the amount of debate that can happen over how the United Kingdom will sever relations with the European Union under Brexit.
We're not going to wait until October the 31st before getting on with our plans to take this country forward. And to do that, we need new legislation. We've got to be bringing forward new and important bills. And that's why we are going to have a Queen's speech, and we're going to do it on October the 14th. And we've got to move ahead now with a new legislative programme.
That voice there, clearly the voice of Boris Johnson, the UK British Prime Minister, who is giving his justification for the suspension. But all of this is raising intense pressure on the Republic of Ireland, which is a member of the European Union, and its neighbor, Northern Ireland, which is a province of the United Kingdom. The open border that separates these two has come under question as part of the Brexit negotiations. If the UK crashes out of the EU without a Brexit deal at the end of October, there could be a disruption at that historic border.
And what could that disruption mean, and what could it do? Let's ask Hugh O'Connell, a political reporter at the Irish Independent, who's on the line on Skype from Dublin. Good morning, Hugh.
Good morning.
Remind us the history here for people who aren't familiar with it. Why is this border so important and in so much focus?
Between 1969 and 1998, there was a conflict in Northern Ireland known as, we call it the Troubles here. And as part of that conflict, which was effectively a sort of an uprising of sorts by nationalist people in Northern Ireland who wanted to get Britain out of the north. There was a very bloody conflict. Thousands died. And the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was a hard border, which meant there were checks, there was army checkpoints, there was infrastructure in place, customs checks. People couldn't move freely back and forth across the border every day, although they tried, but they often experienced long delays. But with the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, all that started to change. And for the past 20 years, the border has been a porous border. In effect, people go back and forth every single day. People who live in the Republic of Ireland can go to school in Northern Ireland. People who live in Northern Ireland can work in the Republic of Ireland. So they're traveling back and forth every day. There's a lot of trade that goes back and forth. Millions of litres of milk that is milked from cows in Northern Ireland is brought down across the border into the Republic of Ireland to be processed and sent into your supermarkets.
So people have just come to live that way, it sounds like. So I guess I wonder, I mean, it's a representation of peace, that open border. How are people reacting to the suspension of Parliament on both sides if they feel like this might bring that hard border back?
Well, people aren't very happy about it. For the past 3 years, Britain's decision to leave the European Union has had massive implications for the border. And the decision to suspend Parliament creates the possibility that Britain, or rather increases the possibility that Britain will crash out of the European Union on the 31st of October, 9 weeks from now, and that hard border will begin to return again with checkpoints, infrastructure, and all the sorts of things that people on this island thought they had seen the last of.
Thought they had moved past. Hugh O'Connell, political reporter at the Irish Independent, joining us from Dublin. Thanks so much, Hugh.
Thank you.
Three of the leading activists from Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement are under arrest.
Right. So the most prominent among them is 22-year-old Joshua Wong. He was walking to a subway station on Friday morning when he was, quote, forcefully pushed into a private minivan on the street in broad daylight. We quote that because it's according to Demosista, which is the youth activist group that Wong leads. He's been involved in the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong for years. As a teenager, he was part of the 2014 so-called Umbrella Movement, which has partly inspired this latest wave of pro-democracy protests that we're seeing in Hong Kong.
All right, Emily Feng is on the line from Hong Kong. She's been following all of this. Hey, Emily.
Hello, good morning.
So what do we know about these three young activists who've been arrested?
Well, besides Joshua Wong, there is Andy Chan and Agnes Chow, and they're all young. They're in their 20s. They're perceived by some as leaders of the current protests, which are now in their fourth month. But they're not the leaders. I think it's important to make that distinction. The current protests are a leaderless movement. The three of them had been leaders in the pro-democracy protest called the Umbrella Movement from 5 years ago, and it was this peaceful occupation of Hong Kong's central business district that then fizzled out after 79 days. But their key demand from that protest 5 years ago, that Hong Kongers be able to elect their own leader, is now being repeated in the current anti-government protests.
Okay, but you said two things there that are really interesting. And the first is these protests have been going on for 4 months. And the second thing is these three kids are not leaders of it. So why arrest them and why arrest them now?
This weekend is a politically significant anniversary. It's the 5th anniversary of Beijing's decision to maintain its control over how Hong Kong's leader is chosen. And it's also the decision that sparked the 2014 umbrella movement in the first place. And so to commemorate the anniversary, there was supposed to be a big march this Saturday, but Hong Kong police have denied the organizers permission. And so organizers said today that they're going to cancel protests. Then on top of the Saturday march, Demisto, the group you mentioned that Wong leads and that Agnes Chow is also part of, they've been organizing these mass student sit-ins and strikes that are going to happen across schools starting Monday, which is when the semester begins. I've also heard of a wave of other arrests that have happened among at least 2 Hong Kong lawmakers and a former student union leader who participated in protests over the last few months. So there seems to be a coordinated wave of arrests across the city today, and they mark an escalation from the Beijing chosen leadership of Hong Kong to put an end to these protests.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it. And organizers canceled the weekend protests. These are the ones that we've been seeing for the past couple of months. People turn up. They're enormous. Does that necessarily mean, if the protest has been canceled, does that necessarily mean that this weekend is just a bust?
No, I think that a lot of people are going to show up to protest. That's what protesters and organizers from Demasisto are saying. And they're even more angry because of the wave of arrests that have been going on. The strikes for Monday and Tuesday are also going full steam ahead. Demasisto, which is the youth activist group that Chow and Wong are part of, were defiant today. They held a press conference in front of the Hong Kong government's offices. And here's a clip of them.
無懼白色恐怖，無懼白色恐怖，抗議警方濫捕，抗議警方濫捕。
They're chanting in protest of what they see as police overreach and terror, and they're still encouraging people to come out this weekend despite the ban and the fear that there are going to be more arrests coming.
NPR's Emily Fang on the line from Hong Kong. Emily, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, the Trump administration wants to roll back yet another Obama-era environmental rule.
Right. So this proposal was released yesterday, and it aims to undo many of the requirements on oil and gas sites to detect and fix methane leaks from wells and pipelines. Methane, obviously a very powerful greenhouse gas. It is 25 times more damaging than carbon dioxide, and it's released during natural gas and oil production. Small oil and gas companies generally oppose the Obama administration rules on methane, but bigger companies have supported them.
NPR's Jeff Brady has been reporting on this story. He's with us in the studio. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning.
All right, so let me ask you about this really interesting split. Small companies want the rules rolled back. They don't want the regulation. But big energy companies actually supported Obama's regulation. What's going on there?
Well, these small oil and gas companies, they generally claim that the rules are too expensive and burdensome. And that's also the argument that the Trump administration makes. But the larger companies, ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell, all names we recognize, they support the rules because they worry what could happen if regulations become too lax. Here's Ben Ratner with the Environmental Defense Fund explaining their logic.
Some companies and their investors realize the risk that the future of American natural gas could be dragged down by industry's worst actors.
Natural gas has a reputation for burning cleaner, but big oil companies worry that reputation could go away if they don't stop those methane leaks.
Oh, that's interesting. So there's a lot on the line for them, including some reputational risk. So why does the Trump administration want to roll back these rules in the first place if big industry supports them?
Well, President Trump put out an executive order telling agencies to review existing regulations that might hamper the growth of domestic energy. The EPA took a look at this rule limiting methane leaks at wells, compressor stations, and other industry operations, and the agency decided there were already other rules in place that they would also limit methane, so they're proposing to get rid of these rules. Now, those other rules, they do exist, but it's not clear that they would be as effective as ones focused only on methane. And environmentalists, along with those big oil companies, say it's important to have that focus because methane is so effective at trapping heat in the atmosphere, of course, making climate change worse.
Yeah. President Trump has gone after several of these Obama-era rules aimed at climate change, hasn't he?
Yeah, there's a pattern. And to understand it, you really have to go back into the Obama presidency. Addressing climate change was a priority for him. He couldn't get Congress to pass laws specifically focused on regulating greenhouse gases. So the administration developed regulations under existing laws, like the Clean Air Act. But critics say the Obama administration overstepped its authority, and they're bringing their legal analysis to a new president who wants to boost the country's fossil fuel business, and that gives the Trump administration a way to start rolling back some of these regulations.
So is this rollback on methane a done deal?
Well, there are some roadblocks. One of them is the oil and gas industry itself. These big companies, investors, they have investors to worry about. They want to show the public that they care about climate change, and rolling back regulations doesn't fit with that thinking. So you have the oil company Shell saying it's going to go ahead with its plans no matter what the administration is doing. They're going to reduce methane emissions. And another potential roadblock is timing. We're just about a year out from the next presidential election, and the EPA still has to put this out for comment, hold a public hearing. And then there's almost certainly going to be a challenge in court. So this could take us well past November 2020.
Okay, well past the election, indeed.
Yep.
NPR's Jeff Brady. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thank you.
Okay, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing what can only be described as a pretty serious backlash after he decided to suspend Parliament early next month.
Save our democracy, stop the coup. That is the voice, the collective voice of Londoners who are protesting in Parliament Square this week after the suspension was approved by the Queen. This move means Parliament will have less time to debate how the United Kingdom will exit the European Union under Brexit, which makes it so controversial. And the whole thing increases the odds that British lawmakers just won't be able to reach a deal before the October 31st deadline, which would send Britain crashing out of the EU. The plan is now facing legal challenges.
NPR's Frank Langfitt has been following all of this messiness. He's on the line. Hey, Frank.
Hey, Noelle.
So now there's a legal effort underway to try and prevent Parliament from being suspended. How is this working?
Well, right now everybody's focused on a court in Scotland, and we're waiting for a verdict this morning. 75 parliamentarians are basically seeking an injunction to stop the suspension. And one of the lawyers representing the parliamentarians, the quote from him was, "The powers of the executive are never unlimited and unfettered. We do not live in a totalitarian state." It's that kind of language right now here in Britain. The government's answer is this is not a question for the court at all. The Queen almost always takes the advice of the Prime Minister, and this suspension is totally normal. So hopefully we'll hear very soon what the court in Scotland thinks about all this.
Okay, it'd be interesting to hear the verdict there. So Parliament is supposed to be convening next week. There will be Brexit negotiations happening, I assume. What are they going to be talking about in that week?
Well, in that week, they only are going to have, they could have as little as 5 days to try to get anything done. So this is considerably less than expected. And what we do expect is members of Parliament who oppose a no deal to begin to try to pass legislation to block the UK from leaving without a deal. And the question is, how long will it take them to do that? Because under the parliamentary system, the Prime Minister controls the agenda. It's not like the United States at all. And so this will take a fair bit of parliamentary maneuvering to get there. What the no-deal members of Parliament, the ones who want to fight this, hope is that then Johnson would either have to go back to Brussels and get a compromise, which now seems quite unlikely, or ask for another extension. And if it got to another extension, most people here think this is all headed, Noelle, to another general election sooner than later.
Wow.
I think most people feel this cannot be resolved without taking this issue back to the people.
Well, let's talk about the people, because I know you traveled to the
Sure.
city of Boston, and this is a place where more people voted in favor of Brexit than any other city in the UK. What are they telling you?
Well, what you hear up here is exactly the opposite of what Rachel was saying just in our introduction. People here are actually supportive of what Johnson is doing. They're sick and tired of all this. I was talking to Michael Reynolds. He's a retired butcher, and he supports Johnson, and this is how he put it.
I don't like the other parties. I think they're all against him. If the Lord Protector of England was still alive, the people who have stopped us from going out in Europe, all their heads would be on Westminster Bridge. You know what I mean, Lord Protector of England, don't you? Oliver Cromwell.
Now, just for history buffs, Oliver Cromwell led an army into the House of Commons, forcibly dissolve Parliament. This was the 1650s. So to translate that, what he's saying is drastic times require drastic action.
Oh, my goodness. NPR's Frank Langfitt talking to us via Skype. Frank, thanks so much.
Happy to do it, Noelle.